Welcome to the parts configuration video. In this video I'm going to demonstrate to parts users how they can configure the parts front end and what some of the options are for using the parts front end. We'll start out by just looking at the color scheme. Under File, Options, you can set your Microsoft Office theme. I've set mine for dark gray. For example, I'll go just to show you a change. We'll do a colorful. You can see we've got a colorful. I prefer the dark gray, so we'll use that. Also, in the configuration menu for parts, you can choose to use the classic light theme or the dark theme. You can uncheck the dark theme if you'd like to use the light theme, and you'd have this light theme. Okay, that's pretty much takes care of the color schemes, and only because it's simpler, I think I'll jump next into some of the configuration options the users have in the parts backend. You can look at the parts backend design through the parts front end by selecting this design, but to actually change it you would need to select the parts backend. In the design view mode. And it's still locked because I tried to open it before I had it closed in the parts front end. I'll try that one more time. Okay, but once you have exclusive privileges, meaning other applications don't have aren't connected to the back end, you can get into it and edit it. One of the features in the parts back end, if you like, you can use manufacturer part number. Most of these options are described over here. If they can be changed here, you can use manufacturer part number or manufacturer part number abbreviated like such. And for probably the most other significant feature is this one here, material control number. You can either put your company name in there. So just as an example, let's say you're at IBM, and let's say that you've decided that you'd prefer to use manufacturer part number. Save the changes. And now when we connect to the parts front end, you'll see it's manufacturer part number. And you can see I didn't get that set there because in addition to setting it in the parts back end, you would need to, in the user defined fields, you're going to need to put your company name. In fact, I think you probably could have done this through just the parts front end. You don't need to go to the back end. For that, the back end, there you go, IBM. Let's take another look at that. Let's say we wanted to change it to ORW, just something different. As you can see now it's ORW. So forget what I mentioned about changing it in the back end. You definitely can change it there, but it doesn't, but the setting in the parts front end overrides whatever's in the back end for that setting. So looking at the parts back end one more time, right click, design view. The only settings you probably really should adjust in here is the company, not the company name. Again, that one will be automatic. It's probably best just to leave that in the material control name. And Anyway, you can choose whether or not you prefer manufacturer part number or manufacturer part number. That's really the only one I think you need to fool with in the parts back end. Close the back end, open the front end again. Anyway, you can see we're back to material control number. Again, we can go into the user defined fields, and if we want that to be ORW, we'd change it here, close, select apply, and that would update it. Maybe in one of the newer releases I'll take a look at defining that manufacturer field from the parts front end. That way you'd really have no reason to open the parts back end. All right, so let's get back into some more configuration options. So in the parts, for example, in the part status field, which is the status of the library, it's not the status necessarily of the manufacturer's part, but this is the library status, meaning it's a new part in the library. Maybe the part's been checked in the library. Maybe it's been released in a design. Maybe you know it's in production, or you've deprecated it, meaning you've left it in the library, but you're letting people know you prefer not to use it, or that it has an end of life, or that it's gone obsolete. Anyway, you can define those in the parts front end under the configuration table. For example, you can see here the life cycle is new, checked, release cycle. So all you need to do is put your life cycles in there separated by semicolons. However, you should keep this first life cycle new. That's used by the tool during part of the validation checks. So keep the first one new, and then you can change the others as you like. Another option that I believe you can set in the parts front end you can do a daily backup if you like. If you're using an Access database, you can perform a daily backup by setting that to yes. But there are really not very many features over here that you need to fool with either. We'll cover maybe some of these other features later on. Okay, anyway, that's how we get this drop-down list populated. One of the other things I like to point out in here is that we have a drop-down list for our manufacturers. You can see this is a fairly short list right here. It has, well, what, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 manufacturers in it. The parts comes pre-populated with a list of manufacturers, and there's 457 back here in the back end. It's not in the back end, it's in another table called parts. And this is just simply an option to use a preferred manufacturer name. So we'll take a look at how that would happen. So notice here that we might have a manufacturer name of Murata and Murata Electronics. If we are using a preferred manufacturer name, so we could check to use preferred manufacturer and supplier names. And let's say if I'm here at Murata Electronics, well, let's go back into the preferred settings for a minute. So notice that I opened up at Murata because that was where we're at in the parts front end. So in the Murata, for example, we might have, as we've gotten data off the internet, some users may have gotten Murata Electronics North America, Murata Power Solutions. But maybe for whatever reason, if you like, you can choose a preferred name. So for Murata Electronics North America, I prefer just to display Murata. Okay, so if after the configuration's been set, anytime that you save a record, if you have the preferred settings set, that would change to just Murata. And a quick way to change all of those would be to actually use tools, export the database. And then you could turn around and import the same database that you just exported. Map the fields over. The fields are going to be the same because it's the same database. In fact, if we did a comparison, we'd see there's no differences found. But there's some options here. One of the options is to use the preferred name. So we could select that, and then we could import the data, update it. And we should see that all the instances of the preferred names were used. So you can now see it's short compared to what it was before. And just to take you back to what we had there before, if we want, we can import the data from the backup. I had a backup copy here. Map it over again. And also in the backup copy, I had used manufacturer part number instead of the abbreviated manufacturer part number. So I'll map that over. And we were using MCN instead of ORW. So I'll just map that over and import those. Okay, so at that point the data should be pretty much the same again. Just to get back to the original settings, I'll just demonstrate taking this back to MCN. MCN stands for Material Control Number, but some people prefer to put their company name or company initials in there, like IBM for International Business Machines, or ORW earlier when I was showing you that was on-ramp wireless. Okay, so anyway, that's our options, and the options are exactly the same for using suppliers. Sometimes you might have suppliers where the supplier name is maybe come in 2 different flavors or something. Or maybe for DigiKey, for example, you can have DigiKey with or without the dash. The proper convention for DigiKey, I believe, is with the dash. So I chose that for mine. So I have my dash here. And we can see that if it didn't have the dash, let's try that again. Remove the dash. And you can see whenever we save the record, the dash is restored. So just an example of using the preferred. Again, those are completely optional. In fact, one of the options in parts is you don't even have to link those tables. Those tables are separate from the parts tables. Altium never sees those tables. They're just a convenient way of standardizing your manufacturer and your supplier names. This is very useful if you're using a PLM system and the PLM system is trying to identify a manufacturer. A lot of times the PLM system will be better to filter and sort, if you will, if you standardize on your manufacturer name. All right, so let's look at what else we can do in the configuration. So we need to jump in the configuration button. So there's a lot of options here. We'll just kind of go down through them. Obviously, we can check our data source. Our data source could be a MySQL database, or it could be an Access database. It can be the old classic MDB, or it can be the newer Access 2007 ACCDB file format, or it can be an ODBC connection to a MySQL database. The parts front end might possibly support other databases, but it's only been tested with MySQL and Access. Okay, so anyway, we would point to our source, and so here, for example, our data source is parts database, and then we also need to point to where our symbols and footprints are if you're going to use a database library. So that's our models folder, and there's where we have our folders for our footprints and symbols. So we could just select, for example, the symbol folder, and the tool will use that folder. We also, it's not completely required, but it's highly recommended that you point to the DB path. So here we'll just point to our DB path, And it's an option. There's some scripts that are optional in the parts front end for using with the parts front end, but we'll cover that separately. Right now I just want to cover the basic options. And then of course there's a folder for our data sheets. Data sheets folder. And then there's a folder for your step models. Okay. Or CAD models. The folder can either be named CAD models or step models, but the folder should be one or the other, CAD models or step models. And then if you like, you can save that configuration. So for example here, I'll just save this as demo, parts demo. And so if you like, later on you can load and recall different formats, or you can share that configuration with other users to get them all in the same configuration that the company libraries decided that all the other users should follow. Okay, so we'll just run down through these configuration options. There's an option to lock the ID field, and what that means is when the ID field is locked, that you can't edit this primary key, which is a good thing because that's your primary key and you wouldn't want to be accidentally changing that. However, if for some reason you actually need to unlock that, you could unlock it and edit the ID field. Okay, there's a release check option that just means that when the tool starts up, it'll go out to the parts blog and look for a later release. And if it finds a newer release of the parts front end, you'll be alerted. Again, we've covered preferred manufacturer and supplier names already, so those are the check blocks for that. We've looked at the dark theme, light theme option. There's also an option to show or not show the access ribbon bar in navigation. We'll look at see what that looks like. So to see the navigation panel and the ribbon's been removed at the top. Go back to that. There's an option to enforce library matching, file names and library references. I'll explain that a little bit. Okay, so here's an example of where the library reference inductor matches the library name inductor, okay, Schlib, and the footprint, for example, name is found right here in the footprint name. And one of the reasons when you're using single libraries to keep the reference and the file name exactly the same, as you can imagine, it's only possible to save one resistor file. If you tried to save another one, it would overwrite it. Well, by having your reference and the library name exactly the same, that guarantees you, if all the footprints are stored and symbols are stored in the same folder, like here all the symbols are stored together, that guarantees you can only have one resistor symbol. That's your master, because if anyone tried to put another resistor symbol in here, it would have to overwrite this one. So you're guaranteed not to have duplicates. And that's one of the benefits also of having a single part libraries, in addition to the fact that if when you have multiple users, one user could be creating a library for a resistor, maybe another one for an inductor or a component, and when they save their library, they wouldn't be stepping on somebody else's work. But if you had a library with 100 parts in it and 2 different users opened it and they were editing it, the last one to save would overwrite the other user's work. So that's another reason for having single part libraries. Okay, back into the configuration. So you can enable this fill mode if you like, and there's an option to generate a library report. So I'll go ahead and create both of those. I'll just stick to doing the fill report at first. Okay, we'll see how that works out for me. What I'm going to do here is just right click in here and say I want to see all the records that equal capacitor. So that's one thing about the parts front end. It was integrated to work with Microsoft Access. For example, when you right click in here, and when I did that right click and said equals capacitor, that's not something that was designed into the tool. That just comes with Microsoft Access. That feature's already there. We'll look at the filter features that are in parts in a little bit. What I'm going to do here is take a couple of these fields a few of them. And now they're not all capacitors, but notice that I'll start over by doing a show all, and then what I'll do is go over to my capacitors, say ceramic type capacitors. Right click, I'll just highlight that, right click, and say begins with ceramic cap. And now that I've got this selected, okay, after filtering our capacitors, we could just click here in the capacitor, and then using the fill mode, all we need to do is double click out in this free space, and it'll pop up will ask us would we like to fill the part type with the word capacitor. Select OK. That's been filled. Same thing with the ceramic. If we wanted to fill that, we could select it, fill them in. Okay, so anyway, that's a example of how the fill mode works. And now we're going to generate a library report. Okay, this is a librarian option again. It's not available in the designer tool. In the designer tool, under verify libraries, they're only able to verify the current library. However, licensed librarians are able, or librarians are able to verify all records. Anyway, they verify pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do is create some issues for this. We're going to change the footprint reference here. This one down here, I'm going to remove the file name, mess it up, and then we're going to go in and do a verify libraries. All right. So you can see it's told us that there's some incorrect missing of file names or incorrect references, and then there's been a tip left just to save the current record for details. Also, there's some information in the library report. So here you can see the footprint reference and file name aren't matched, and if we were to hit save, it would take us right to the offending cell. In this particular case, the tool has actually read the library reference that is in the file, and it has seen that it ends with an N, and it's asking if you'd just like to change it. And so we can say yes. And it's telling us here that the file's not found. Okay, so if we can't find a file, obviously we have nothing to read. So what we could do is go look for that file. Select, and we could start looking for it. If we delete a few characters back, Windows will display the available file names, and you may remember this was the least type file, least type footprint. Because what I have is for IPC standards, you can have a nominal, a least, and a most. I rarely ever use the most footprint. Occasionally I will, but for the most part I only bother with the nominal footprint and the least footprint personally. Or you can have a most footprint if you also like, and you can put them in any order that you like. That's up to you. All right, so anyway, now we'll see that if we verify the files again, they all verified and the library report is clear. Now, you may have noticed that this library field was automatically added when we went into the configuration menu and checked this feature here. However, the field is not automatically removed from the parts database. If you'd like to remove it, you can go into configuration and check the unbound fields. Let's see, I was expecting that to be an unbound field. Let's see, I'll skip a step. In the user-defined fields, to unbind a field from the user-defined fields, we'll need to create a blank. Just delete it like that. Close, hit apply, and now it'll be removed. Okay, but it's been only removed from the parts front end, which also means that you can use the methods that I just showed you to create unbound fields, because just because you don't have a field displayed in the parts front end doesn't mean maybe you don't want it to show up in your Altium parts. So you can have, in addition to all the fields displayed here, you can always put fields in the symbols, or you can put fields in the database that would be passed on. It's just that you don't have a user interface for editing those fields here. That data would have to be changed over in the schematic. So we have an unbound field of library report now because it wasn't bound to the parts front end anymore, and we can delete that if we like. Now it's been deleted from the parts backend database, and it's also not bound to the front end. All right. Now there's some save button options, and what that means is whenever we hit the save button, those options are executed. Okay. Some of the options are also executed if you just cursor forward. A good way to show you some of the things that Parts is doing for you when records are saved is, for example, if you've ever cut and pasted data from the internet, you know that you can get some troublesome characters. You can get carriage returns, line feeds, tab characters, characters that shouldn't be in your data. When you enter data from the internet into the Parts front end and hit save, it will always clean up the data. So you can see here as an example, it removed any spaces, extra double spaces. Here I'm going to hit the Control End key for a moment. Control End, and you can see there we have an extra. I'll hit Control End again. So we've shifted down the data, and anyway, Parts takes care of a lot of these things. We just hit save, and it removes the leading carriage return line feed that shouldn't have been there. Okay. Anyway, some of the options is that when you hit the save button, you can be alerted that you have a duplicate part number. You can be alerted if the part's not RoHS compliant. There's an option to bill to manufacturers. So let's look back at some of those. Let's look first at the duplicate part number. What we'll do there is we'll just use make like, and we'll clone this record. That means it'll be exactly the same. So we've made a duplicate record with the same part number because we cloned it, and if we hit save, you'll see that we've been alerted that we have a duplicate in the database. And it's right here. It's floated to the top. It's been sorted to the top. And that'll give you an opportunity to review it and consider that maybe you don't want it in the database, and you could delete it, and then you would be looking at the part that you were interested in the first place. You were trying to find that part. Maybe you didn't realize it was already in the database. To get into an unfiltered view, you would just select Show All. Also, if you take a moment to hover over any of these buttons, you'll get a tip for using the buttons. Okay, so that was the duplicate, and then there's the RoHS. So if we have the RoHS feature enabled, and let's say if it's unknown, and also if it's a new part, and you hit save, you'll be warned that it's not RoHS compliant. So let's go back and read the notes there. So notice it was going to be alert the user when the record's been saved and the life cycle's new. Okay, and the same thing for the duplicate when the life cycle's new. And that's because you might be looking at this later on, and even though you don't know the condition of it, or maybe it's even no or not applicable, you don't want the tool to keep nagging you. So by moving to a checked state or any one of these other states other than new, then you can save the record without having a nagging pop-ups. Okay. This one was yes. So anyway, also the parts front end, let's set that to unknown for a moment. And let's go back out to DigiKey. We can get back out to DigiKey several different ways using the parts front end. We can select on the supplier's little shopping cart here. Kind of took that theme, if you will, after the fact that all the suppliers have a shopping cart. Another way to get back out to the supplier is just double-click in the black hat. But regardless of which way you get there, when you drag and drop the URL back into the black hat It'll update, and if you're updating a record and the part number's not changing, you're always going to see this blue information, which is kind of nice because you have the confidence of knowing that you're not changing your part number, you're just changing some other parametric data or updating a data sheet or something else. If you were actually changing the part number, there would be a yellow diamond here alerting you that you're about to change the part number. Okay. So anyway, you can see the RoHS status changed to yes. That's because we were able to determine, looking at the data on the DigiKey website, that the part was RoHS compliant. And we could see that data right down here. It was compliant. Now, parts doesn't go into trying to define whether or not it's RoHS 3, RoHS 2. If you need that level of detail, you can change the configuration options in the parts front end. And down here under RoHS, you can add other types in here. So I mean, if you wanted to say RoHS 3, you would add a semicolon, and so let's just say RoHS 3. Okay. Close that. And let's see if we've gotten anything new here. Now, the parts front end will only reload these defaults when you restart the parts front end. Or we could have gone over to the configuration apply button also, and that would have done it. So we could have gone over to here and just hit apply, and that would have also set it. But anyway, now we can see the RoHS 3 options here. Let's go back and try that again. We'll go back into the parts configuration. And I'm going to this time get rid of the RoHS 3 because I don't care to have that in, at least in my data set. And we should be able to just go to configuration and hit apply. And if we check the list, we'll see that we don't have the RoHS 3 in there anymore. All right, continuing on with the configuration options. That's the RoHS. Let's take a look at the build manufacturer for capacitors, resistors, inductors when the description is blank. Again, when the description is blank. So, for example, if our description field is blank and we were to hit the save key, notice the description field was rebuilt. The way Parts was able to rebuild the description key is it knows it was a capacitor by looking at the part type. It knows that it was a ceramic capacitor by looking at the subtype. So this is the subtype field, and this is the part type field in the subtype. Part type, subtype. Just delete this record for a moment. Let me get back to one of those capacitors. But anyway, the way it rebuilt the field is all of this data is here somewhere below. If you look at it, okay, the 47 microfarad, 0.0047 microfarads is here. The tolerance is here. The voltage is here. The package case is here. So all of that was just rebuilt from that data. And that could be useful if you're trying to build up your own large set of resistors or capacitors, because you could export out to an Excel data sheet, and then if you didn't want to have to manually build this yourself, you could just fill in the fields with the values, the tolerances, the case sizes, and the working voltage, and then you could import the data and one of the options is to build the manufacturer descriptions. So even if the descriptions were not in the data that's being imported and you selected build, it would build those for the capacitors, inductors, and resistors. Okay. One other thing we'd like to point out while we're there, for those who may not know, regardless of whether you go to DigiKey or Mouser, that the parts front end supports drag and drop to the hat from Mouser and DigiKey. You can put data manually from any website into the parts front end by dragging and dropping text into these fields, but the black hat only supports DigiKey and Mouser, and that's by design, because I didn't want to have to support 20 different suppliers. But anyway, regardless of whether the data for resistors, capacitors, inductors comes from DigiKey or Mouser, they'll always be consistent and in the same format. Okay, so here we have an option to copy the manufacturer part number to the value field if the value field is blank. Okay. Well, when parts gets an inductor, capacitor, resistor, it always tries to fill in the value field with the capacitance, the resistance, or the inductance. Okay. And if it's not a resistor or a capacitor, let's pick something else, like maybe this ferrite bead. Notice it's got the value of the part number. So when you hit save, it's going to fill it in with the part number of the bead. Same thing with any IC. It's just going to fill in the value field. And the reason I like to do that personally is because that means I only have to display the value field in the schematic to display my resistance, my capacitance, my part number, no matter what it is. I don't have to go around and remember to set up a display for resistance, another display for capacitance, and another display for inductance. They're just all there displayed in the value field. Okay. All right, so there's an option to lock the records after button's been used. Let's take a look at that. Go back to the configuration. Lock records. So we need to hit apply to set that one. So we can see here that it's already in a locked state after setting that. Now that means we can't edit this record right now, but if we wanted to edit it, we'd select the edit button, and this button toggles between edit and view. Also, when you can edit the record, you'll see a green checkbox over in the corner, and when it's in the view only mode, you'll have a red box, meaning you can't edit the record. But anyway, we'll get back into the edit mode, and you can see here, just to show you something's happening, we'll put some spaces in here. And then when we hit save, notice the record went into the locked mode. Some users like that because they at least like to keep the front end a little more accident proof. That means that as you're scrolling around, searching or playing in the database, you have a less chance of accidentally changing a record. But if you need to edit a record, just select edit, change it, and then hit save. Okay. There's also an option to replace Greek letters. A little bit of advice on that. It's certainly a user option. I prefer to replace mine, and the reason is because if you ever start exporting your data out of the parts database and into spreadsheets and into other tools, maybe an assembly line or a contract manufacturer you're working with has asked you for some data, and when you transfer that data to them, if it has Greek characters, some of those Greek characters will not be translated properly, and they'll have to spend a little bit of time cleaning up your data. So by not using Greek letters in the first place, you won't have those problems. So in my case, for example, I prefer to just use a small u, or like I'm just trying to think, do I have a nanofarad capacitor here? We'll use the filter here just to display that. Here's all our 0402 capacitors. We'll hit apply and just see what we have here. All right, so I didn't define any of these with anything other than microfarads and picofarads, but anyway, it's the only Greek characters anyway is the microfarad, the little u, and the omega symbol for resistors for ohms. I'll just use the filter again. One of the defaults for the filter, we'll show how to make defaults later. We could just display all of our resistors. These are wildcards, so this in this case is we're going to do part type, package case where it contains 0402. And we'd see that we have 4 resistors there. And notice I don't have any Greek symbols in there. I just have the word ohm. Okay. Anyway, that's optional. If you like Greek characters, you use them. Personally, I don't like the trouble that comes along with them. All right, so there's also an option to verify the library files whenever the Save button is selected. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't want to do that. Let's take a look at that for a moment, though. For example, you could have a library reference without a library file, and if you hit Save, well, you wouldn't be alerted to any problem, because if parts doesn't see a library file, it can't look in a file that doesn't exist to see if the reference is matched. So if you like, you can leave a reference in there, but when you bring the library into Altium, you also will find footprint not found or footprint missing. And then if you come back to the parts front end, you would see, yes, you have an issue there. But also, it might be interesting to point out, if you do know the library reference, when you get ready to select the library, parts will automatically use that reference, try to match it to the library, and if it is matched to the library, you could just say OK and hit Save, and you would be done. Okay. And the other, going at it the other way, let's say that you can select the library file. And parts fills in the library reference for you if it's a single part library. Now, if it's a multi-part library, parts also can use multi-part libraries. It's not restricted to single part libraries. But if you have a part with 100 footprints in it, well, there's 100 references in the library. The parts front end will need to know, you'll need to enter in to the parts front end which one of those 100 footprint references you're trying to use with this part. When it's a single part library, it's obvious. It's only one part, so parts can pull that automatically for you. But if you're going to use a multi-part library, you're going to need to fill in the footprint reference. All right, and then parts has the ability also to check library symbols to see if footprints have been placed in the symbols. In a database library, typically, like let's take an example, the resistor symbol here. If we were to open it in Altium into the library editor and look in it, we would see that there's no footprints, there's no parametric data, we only have the graphical data. That's because, as you may know, if you've used a database library, the footprint is married to the symbol through the database, through Altium's dblib file, and the parametric data is matched. So the parametric data, the symbol, and the footprint are 3 separate pieces of data that are pulled together by the Altium dblib file. All right, I think that covers the configuration options. Thanks for sticking with me. I know that was a pretty long-winded presentation, but for those who are trying to learn how to configure the parts front end, I hope you found the video useful. If you have any questions, as always, you can click on the parts over here or go to PCBpartsblogspot.com, click on the Contact Parts button, drop your email address in there, leave me a question, or ask that I contact you, and I'll be happy to get back to you and support you. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you enjoy using parts.